Your brain is literally wired to stay poor. I want to describe something to you, and I want you to tell me, honestly, if this sounds familiar. You know what you're supposed to do with money. You've read the articles. You've watched the videos. You know about emergency funds and compound interest, and not carrying a credit card balance. You understand the logic. You've even felt motivated, sometimes genuinely motivated to change things, and then something happens. Not something dramatic, just life. A hard week at work. A conversation that didn't go the way you hoped. A moment of boredom or exhaustion or loneliness. And suddenly you're spending money you didn't plan to spend on something that felt good for about 20 minutes. And then you're sitting with the receipt or the empty cart confirmation email. And a feeling that's hard to name, not quite regret. Not quite shame. Something flatter than both of those. Something that sounds like, of course I did that. Of course, if that sounds familiar, I need you to hear something clearly before we go any further. That pattern, the knowing and still not doing, the deciding and then undoing, the loop of intention and collapse, is not a character flaw. It is not laziness. It is not proof that you don't care enough or want it badly enough or have what it takes. It is neuroscience. Your brain is running programs that were written for a world that no longer exists, executing responses to financial stress that evolution designed for survival, not wealth building. And the gap between what you know you should do and what you actually do is not a gap in your willpower. It is a gap in the design of the human brain as it encounters a financial system it was never built to navigate. Today we are going to go inside that gap. We're going to look at the actual neuroscience, the studies, the brain scans, the documented mechanisms that explain why smart, capable, motivated people consistently make financial decisions that contradict their own stated goals. And then we're going to look at the system that has been built around those vulnerabilities, because the story does not end in a laboratory. It ends in a boardroom, in a marketing department, in a policy office, in every institution that has learned to profit from the specific ways human brains malfunction under financial pressure. I'm going to start with a story, not a parable. An actual documented scientific experiment. In 2013, two researchers named Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir published a book called Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Mullainathan is an economist at the University of Chicago. Shafir is a psychologist at Princeton. They spent years studying what poverty actually does to the brain, not metaphorically, not philosophically, but measurably, functionally, in terms of cognitive capacity and decision-making ability. What they found was so counterintuitive and so important that I want to spend real time on it, because it reframes almost everything the personal finance industry has ever told you about why you're struggling. Their core finding was this: scarcity, the experience of having too little, whether too little money or too little time, does not just create stress. It creates a specific cognitive condition that they called the bandwidth tax. And that bandwidth tax, once you understand it, explains patterns of behavior that have baffled economists, frustrated financial advisors, and caused millions of people to blame themselves for outcomes that were, in meaningful ways, neurologically determined. Before we get to the math of this, and there is real measurable math, I want to stay with the feeling of it for a moment longer. Because if you have spent years inside financial stress, you know something that people who haven't experienced it don't fully understand. The feeling is not just worry. It is a kind of cognitive weather, a constant, low-pressure system that sits over every decision you make. Buying groceries involves math you didn't choose to do. Answering your phone involves a calculation about who might be calling and what they might want. Seeing a number on a screen, any number on any screen, briefly floods your nervous system before your rational brain catches up and confirms it's not what you feared. Living this way is exhausting in a way that people who've only experienced normal financial stress sometimes struggle to believe. And the research that Mullainathan and Shafir conducted shows that the exhaustion is real, it is measurable, and it has consequences that go far beyond mood. The math, the bandwidth tax, cognitive load, and the neuroscience of financial decisions. Here is the specific experiment that changed how I think about all of this. Mullainathan and Shafir tested cognitive function in two groups, low-income and higher-income individuals. They gave both groups a series of IQ-style tests, fluid intelligence tasks, the kind that measure abstract reasoning and problem-solving. Before the tests, they primed some participants by asking them to think about a financial scenario involving a moderate car repair, something like $300. For wealthy participants, this priming had no measurable effect on test performance. For low-income participants, thinking about a $300 problem reduced their cognitive test scores by the equivalent of 13 IQ points. 13 points. That is, to be precise, the cognitive difference between a performance baseline and what researchers classify as significant impairment. 13 IQ points is not a rounding error. It is the difference between performing well and performing as though you had not slept in 36 hours. It is a measurable, documented, repeatable effect. And it occurs not because low-income individuals are less intelligent, but because the financial stress of their situation is consuming cognitive resources that wealthy individuals simply do not have to spend. The car repair problem is not abstract for someone whose checking account cannot absorb it. For that person, encountering the problem activates a genuine cognitive crisis, a cascade of calculations, contingency plans, anxieties, and prioritization conflicts that runs in the background of every subsequent decision. The wealthy person can set the problem aside. The low-income person cannot, because the problem is real and the consequences of ignoring it are real. This is the bandwidth tax, and it compounds in a specific painful way. The decisions that financial stress impairs most severely are precisely the decisions that would help escape financial stress: long-term planning, impulse control, evaluation of complex trade-offs, resistance to manipulative marketing. The worse your financial situation, the more of your cognitive capacity is consumed by managing it, and the less capacity you have available to make the decisions that might improve it. Scarcity creates the cognitive conditions that perpetuate scarcity. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented neurological feedback loop. Now let's add a second mechanism, because the bandwidth tax is only the beginning. The second piece of neuroscience we need to understand involves something called temporal discounting, and it operates through a completely different part of the brain, specifically, the competition between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and what happens to that competition under conditions of scarcity. Temporal discounting is the tendency to value rewards that are available now more highly than rewards that are available in the future. This is universal. Every human brain discounts the future to some degree. The psychology literature documents it extensively. $100 today feels more valuable than $110 in a month. $1,000 now feels more valuable than $1,200 in a year. The present is concrete. The future is abstract. The present activates reward circuitry directly. The future must be simulated by the prefrontal cortex, which requires cognitive effort. Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and abstract reasoning, exerts regulatory control over the limbic system's preference for immediate reward. It says, in effect, wait. The future version of this is better. Under conditions of financial scarcity, that regulatory capacity is compromised. The bandwidth tax reduces the resources available to the prefrontal cortex, and the result is that temporal discounting steepens dramatically. The future feels not just abstract, but irrelevant. The present demand is overwhelming. And financial decisions that look from the outside like poor impulse control are, from the inside, the outputs of a brain whose regulatory architecture has been partially disabled by the demands of surviving in scarcity. There is a third mechanism that sits at the intersection of neuroscience and behavioral economics, and it is the one that the financial services industry has turned into an art form. It is called loss aversion, and it was first formally documented by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979 in what is now one of the most cited papers in the history of psychology. Their finding: the psychological pain of losing something is approximately twice as powerful as the psychological pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Losing $20 hurts roughly twice as much as finding $20 feels good. This asymmetry is not rational, it is neurological. It is encoded in the way the brain processes threat versus reward. For people in financial scarcity, loss aversion operates at a heightened intensity because the stakes of loss are genuinely higher. Losing $50 when you have $500 in the bank is a different neurological event than losing $50 when you have $12,000. The percentage impact is real. The disruption to financial stability is real. And the brain processes the threat of loss accordingly, with an urgency that can override long-term planning, trigger defensive financial behaviors, and make people extremely vulnerable to the specific marketing strategies that exploit loss aversion directly. We'll come back to that exploitation in the next segment. But first, I want to name one more neurological mechanism because it completes the picture of what we're actually dealing with: ego depletion. The concept, developed by the psychologist Roy Baumeister, holds that willpower is not an unlimited resource. It is a finite cognitive fuel that depletes with use. Every act of self-regulation, every time you resist an impulse, make a deliberate choice, override an automatic response, draws on a shared reservoir. When that reservoir is depleted, self-regulation fails. You make worse decisions. You are more susceptible to temptation. You default to automatic behavior rather than deliberate choice. Now consider what a full day of financial scarcity looks like in terms of ego depletion. The number of self-regulatory decisions a low-income person makes before noon, every purchase evaluated against a balance that cannot absorb errors, every spending impulse weighed against competing needs, every financial communication managed against a backdrop of anxiety, exceeds the number of equivalent decisions a financially secure person might make in several days. By the time the evening comes and the impulsive purchase happens, or the budget falls apart, or the decision gets made that will seem inexplicable in the morning, the tank is empty, not because of weakness, because of how many times it was called on that day. The system, how institutions profit from your brain's vulnerabilities. What I have just described to you, the bandwidth tax, temporal discounting under scarcity, loss aversion, ego depletion, is not secret knowledge. It is published academic research, available in peer-reviewed journals, taught in business schools, and applied in practice by the marketing, financial services, and technology industries with extraordinary precision and at extraordinary scale. The human brain's financial vulnerabilities are not incidental features that the market has happened to stumble upon. They are a mapped terrain, and the institutions that interact with your financial life, every bank, every retailer, every subscription service, every credit card company, every social media platform, have invested billions of dollars in understanding that terrain and engineering their products to extract maximum revenue from it. Let's start with loss aversion, because it is the vulnerability that financial products exploit most aggressively and most visibly. Loss aversion is the engine behind every countdown timer on every checkout page you have ever seen. It is behind every limited stock warning, every flash sale that ends at midnight, every notification that tells you someone else is looking at this item right now. These are not neutral design choices. They are deliberate engineering decisions whose purpose is to activate your brain's loss aversion circuitry, to make you feel that you are about to lose something, so that the pain of that anticipated loss overrides the deliberate, prefrontal cortex-mediated calculation of whether you can actually afford the purchase. This works. It is documented to work. And it works most powerfully on people whose prefrontal cortex is already bandwidth taxed by financial stress, precisely the population most vulnerable to the consequences of impulsive spending. Now let's look at temporal discounting and what the financial services industry has built around it. The payday loan industry is, structurally, an exploitation of steep temporal discounting. The person who takes a $300 payday loan at 391% annualized interest is not making a calculation error. They are making a decision in which the present need is overwhelming, and the future cost is being discounted by a brain under scarcity-induced impairment. The loan industry knows this. The product is designed for it. The storefront location, consistently in low-income neighborhoods, never in wealthy suburbs, is a targeting decision based on the known distribution of scarcity-induced temporal discounting. It is not a market serving an underserved community. It is a market harvesting a neurologically vulnerable one. The credit card industry operates on the same mechanism with a longer timeline and a more sophisticated delivery system. Minimum payment requirements are calibrated to the precise point where the monthly cost feels manageable, activating the brain's present focus, while the long-term interest accumulation remains abstract and untriggered. The gap between the psychologically accessible monthly payment and the financially devastating total cost is engineered, not accidental. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau data shows that people who carry a balance pay an average of over $2,000 per year in interest, and most of them consistently intend to pay off the balance soon. The intention is genuine. The brain's temporal discounting is also genuine. The product is designed to exist in the space between them. The retail industry's exploitation of ego depletion is perhaps the most mundane but also the most pervasive. Grocery stores place the candy and impulse purchases at checkout, the final point in a shopping trip, after decision fatigue has been accumulated across every aisle. Amazon's one-click purchasing eliminates the friction that allows the prefrontal cortex to intervene between impulse and execution. Every UX dark pattern, the pre-checked upgrade box, the confusing cancellation flow, the default auto-renewal, is an engineering decision designed to let the limbic system execute a purchase before the regulatory system has time to evaluate it. Social media platforms have added a dimension to this that is genuinely new in human history, and it connects to the relative deprivation theory that I want to spend a moment on. Robert Merton's concept, developed in the 1940s and extensively validated since, holds that people evaluate their own welfare not by absolute measures, but by comparison to reference groups. You don't feel wealthy or poor in a vacuum. You feel wealthy or poor relative to the people around you. For most of human history, that reference group was geographically constrained. You compared yourself to your neighbors, your coworkers, the people in your immediate social world. Social media has replaced that constrained reference group with an algorithmically curated highlight reel of the most aspirational consumption behavior from millions of people worldwide. The result is a massive upward shift in the comparison baseline. You are now comparing your everyday life to the curated best moments of people specifically selected by an algorithm to maximize your time on platform. And maximum time on platform correlates directly with the emotional state most likely to produce spending. The specific anxiety of feeling that your life is inadequate relative to what you are seeing. What I want to be very precise about here is that none of these mechanisms require bad intentions from individuals to function. The checkout clerk at the grocery store did not design the candy rack. The customer service representative at the Payday loan company is probably also financially stressed. The engineer who designed the one-click purchase button may have believed they were improving user experience. The system does not require individual malice. It requires only that the financial incentives of the institutions involved align with the extraction of value from cognitive vulnerabilities, and they do, precisely, in every case I have described. The brain science is the infrastructure. The financial architecture is the application built on top of it. And the people most exposed to that application are the ones whose cognitive resources are most depleted by the scarcity that the same system helped produce. Here's the thing about the neuroscience I've just described. It is not a counsel of despair. Understanding that your brain has specific, documented vulnerabilities in financial contexts is not the same as saying those vulnerabilities are insurmountable. It means you need a different kind of strategy, one that works with the architecture of the brain rather than against it. The standard personal finance advice model tells you to use willpower, discipline, and motivation to overcome your financial patterns. The neuroscience tells us that willpower is a depletable resource, that motivation is neurochemically unstable, and that discipline applied against a brain running in scarcity mode is like trying to push a car uphill with the handbrake on. It is not impossible. It is just not the optimal approach. The more effective approach is environmental design. If the research shows that ego depletion is real and that depleted willpower produces worse financial decisions, then the goal is to reduce the number of financial decisions that require active willpower, not by avoiding them, but by making the right decision the automatic one. This is the insight behind what behavioral economists call choice architecture, and it has been validated extensively in the research. Automatic enrollment in retirement savings plans increased participation rates from under 40% to over 90% in workplaces that adopted it. Not by increasing education, not by improving motivation, but by changing the default. The decision still exists. The opt-out is still available. But the friction has been moved from staying in to getting out. And friction, in a brain navigating ego depletion, is decisive. The practical application of this principle is straightforward, if not always easy. The goal is to take every financial decision you consistently make correctly in your best moment and automate it, so that it does not require a best moment to execute. Automatic transfers to savings on payday, before the money is visible in checking and available for spending, removes the decision from the ego-depleted evening entirely. Automatic minimum payments on debt prevent the specific failure mode where a depleted brain skips a payment it intended to make. Removing stored payment information from retail websites reintroduces the friction that allows the prefrontal cortex to intervene. Unsubscribing from promotional emails eliminates the loss aversion trigger before it activates. None of these moves require willpower in the moment. They require one deliberate decision, made once in a moment of clarity, that then runs without further input. The second lever is cognitive load reduction, and it connects directly to the bandwidth tax research. If scarcity consumes cognitive bandwidth and impaired bandwidth produces worse decisions, then anything that reduces the cognitive load of managing money has a compounding positive effect. This is the real value of a budget, not as a discipline tool, but as a cognitive offload device. A budget that runs automatically, that categorizes transactions without your intervention, that presents you with one number, how much discretionary spending remains this week, instead of requiring you to mentally reconstruct your financial position from raw data, reduces the number of active calculations your brain must perform. The brain that is not doing math is a brain with more resources available for the decisions that matter. Similarly, reducing financial fragility, even incrementally, even in small amounts, has a documented effect on cognitive bandwidth that exceeds its financial size. The research shows that a $500 emergency fund does not merely provide $500 of financial cushion. It provides a qualitatively different psychological relationship to money, one in which a moderate unexpected expense does not trigger the full crisis calculation cascade. The brain that knows it has a buffer does not engage its scarcity mode at the same threshold. The 13 IQ point impairment begins at a higher trigger point. The temporal discounting is less steep. The loss aversion is less overwhelming. Building even a small buffer is not just a financial move. It is a neurological upgrade. The third lever is what I would call loop interruption, and it addresses the specific mechanism of the ego-depleted impulsive spending that most people recognize in themselves most painfully. The research on impulse control shows that a time delay, any meaningful pause between the impulse and the action, dramatically improves decision quality. Not because the delay provides more information, but because it allows the prefrontal cortex to re-engage after the initial limbic activation. A rule that says nothing above $50 gets purchased without a 24-hour wait is not about denying yourself. It is about ensuring that the part of your brain responsible for evaluating long-term consequences is online when the decision gets made. That rule, applied consistently, eliminates the specific category of purchases that are most reliably regretted. The impulse buys made under ego depletion, activated by loss aversion triggers in a state of temporal discounting. I want to close with the thing that I think matters most about this entire conversation. The neuroscience of financial decision-making is one of the most heavily researched and least publicly discussed bodies of knowledge in the financial education space. The research is not hidden. It is published. It is accessible. It is taught in every business school of consequence. And yet the public conversation about financial behavior overwhelmingly centers on character, on discipline and motivation, and the right mindset, rather than on brain architecture and environmental design. That asymmetry is not accidental. A financial education framework built on neuroscience and environmental design is one that individuals can act on privately without purchasing anything, by automating decisions they already know are correct and reducing the cognitive load their financial situation imposes. A financial education framework built on character and mindset is one that requires continuous improvement, continuous reading, continuous courses, continuous products, continuous influencer content, because it locates the problem in a self that is always not quite fixed enough. The first framework is complete in itself. The second is a subscription. And the financial education industry has built itself as a subscription. Your brain is not broken. It is running ancient code in a modern financial environment that was engineered by people who understand that code intimately and have spent enormous resources designing systems that exploit it. The answer is not to overcome your brain. The answer is to build structures around it that protect the good decisions you already know how to make from the moments when your brain cannot make them on its own. The architecture does the work that willpower cannot sustain. You already know what the right decisions look like. Your brain just needs help executing them consistently. That's not a personal failure. That's neuroscience. And now that you know the mechanism, you can start building the systems that account for it. Thank you for watching. If this reframed something you've been hard on yourself about, it was supposed to. Share it with someone who has been calling themselves undisciplined when what they actually are is overstretched. Subscribe if you want more of this. And I'll see you next week.